Hello. So today I'm going to answer the questions, what is representation? Um, so Stuart Hall talks about representation with media studies and kind of like what the general idea of representation or like representation, as he talks about, is generally talked about. And then how cultural studies, and he identifies it within cultural studies. Also, I want to get a little bit into semiotics because it seemed like he was talking a little bit about that as well, which would be kind of Roland Barthes academia. But anyways, um, so representation. Stuart Hall talks about representation in the general sense, the way that people define it, being this idea of having like a true meaning and then having some kind of like distortion of it, and that being or distortion or mirroring of the actual true meaning, quote unquote. Then he complicates this and talks about how there's actually within cultural studies, within what the discourse that he's kind of created around it, that there is not necessarily just this true meaning, but that representation is really more constitutive, which means that it's part of the actual meaning. So there's not necessarily this true meaning and then the representation, but that the representation is as much a part of creating the meaning as is the actual thing. Like, what is the actual thing without its representation? What does it really mean? And that is kind of what we get into. I wanted to just add in a little bit about semiotics because he talked a little bit about, if you have an image and then you, so basically within semiotics, we have an image and you have the signified and the signifier. So the image being like the thing that is being signified, and then the signifier being like the sign for it. And I think that was kind of an interesting aspect to look at as well. I don't want to get too deep into it because we have to talk about a lot of things. So I think that Stuart Hall's definition of representation aligned with my own pretty well. However, I think that he did bring up an interesting point in that, this is meant to complicate the way that we think about representation rather than to suggest that. I think it would be easy for some people to suggest that it's like a little too, how do I put it? It would be easy to say, okay, like if it can be not just one true meaning, then it could be any meaning. And I think rather he's talking about the way that these things process, and also that context is really important. Like when he was talking about the issue in Northern Ireland and the meeting and how you have to know about the history of it. And I think the thing that really was salient for me in that moment was that if we think about that singular event, we think about all the history and we think about the way in which media was analyzing that event, we can also think that it had an inherent meaning to maybe an inherent person at that time, within the context that they knew, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe that could be one way of thinking of it. But then if we think about, okay, let's say it was 5 minutes later. Let's say there was more new context. Let's say it was 100 years later and different people are analyzing it. That same event could then have many different meanings that still contribute to, or could have different representations that contribute to different meanings of the same event. And so I think that's kind of what Stuart Hall was trying to get at in the complexity of representation. So what is being represented in the piece of media that you selected? So I watched an episode of Blackish, which is a great show that I have not watched enough of. And I watched an episode of Blackish where they were dealing with the concept of like whether or not to call the police. And the family is all black. but is dealing with this, the kind of concept of like Black-ish, is that the father, from what I understand, I've just watched like this one episode fully through, but from what I understand, the father feels like he raised a family with his wife, and they didn't like, maybe haven't always addressed, well, I don't know. I don't know that I can like speak to it completely, but maybe that like their family is like, basically their family is still struggling with like issues of like how to represent themselves and how to deal with like race issues. And so um in the, I think in the piece of media that was being represented was like this struggle with like a family that in ways like has class privilege, but then in other ways, you know, is still very like disadvantaged because of the color of their skin, which is of course absurd. But then we see like, you know, we see at one moment Dre is like feeling the privilege of being able to call the police because he is a homeowner, and being able to use and like exercise that privilege. And then we see him later, after his son has called the police on like an all black party, that Dre was walking over to ask them to turn, to like just basically turn the volume down. Um, we see Dre like sitting at the curb, like having his ID checked by the police very quickly, like across from his home. And so those tables turn really, really quickly. And I think that was supposed to represent just, you know, how salient this difference is between like class privilege and race still, and like how important race is, regardless of, you know, what class, you know, and that's intersectionality. And yeah. So let's see, finally, what ways, if any, have you begun to think about representation differently? Oh man, I think I mean, that's such a big question. Um, and I only have half a minute, but I think I would say, if anything, more than anything, it's just expanding. And I think that's what I think of when I think of representation. Like, good representation is more representation, and representation by, you know, that one of, like, by the people who are trying to represent themselves, like having a black director, for example. That's a very short answer, but I'm at 8 minutes, and thank you very much.